And thank you so much for joining us today at this event, which is all about creating an effective board. My name's Sally Bagwell, and I'm Associate Director for Strategy and Decision Making at MPC. Really delighted to be with you today. As you all know, I'm sure, this is an absolutely vitally important topic and quite a nuanced one, because it's about processes and about structures, but it's also about people and dynamics and working together. And we'll have a chance through the 90 minutes we've got together today to cover all of that. And we've got some excellent speakers sharing their perspectives and lots of chance for you to ask questions and to participate. So really looking forward to the session today. We're extremely grateful to the Clothworkers Company for supporting this event series so that it could be offered to you free of charge, and to support you as you volunteer your time and your energy and your trustee and your governance roles. The Clothworkers Company has a long-standing commitment to supporting trustees and to governance, and we're absolutely delighted that there is now a wealth of resources on MPC's website which are available for free, drawn from previous events such as this one. So do take a look at that. There'll be a link in the chat if this is a topic that you're thinking about and looking for other kind of areas of development and ideas. We've also got an upcoming event on the 20th of March, which is about campaigning and the role of trustees in the organisation supporting and sort of safely navigating some of the restrictions around campaigning as we head towards the general election. So if that's something that you're thinking about, it'd be great to see you there on the 20th of March. We have some quick housekeeping. This is a public event, so you're welcome and indeed encouraged to share about it using the hashtag MPC trusteeship. And we're also recording the event, as you'll see, and it will be available afterwards on MPC's YouTube channel. Yeah, freely available. We have 3 speakers today. So the structure of our session is that I'll do a quick introduction. I won't take too much of our time, because really keen to hear from the speakers who are highly expert and really interesting on this subject. So after my introduction, I will introduce each of the 3 speakers in turn, and they will offer a short presentation on their kind of key takeaway on this topic, and we'll have some time to ask them questions afterwards, so individual questions initially, and then after each of the 3 speakers has presented and had the initial questions, we'll move to a more shared question session. We can have a bit more conversation and explore some of the cross-cutting themes, which I'm pretty sure will come up. I may take chair's prerogative with the questions if needed, but I think this event's going to be a lot more fun, a lot more interesting, and a lot more tailored to you and where you're at if you share your questions for the speakers. So you can do that anytime in the Q&A function, which is should be available and visible at the bottom of your screen. If you have any challenges with that, or any technical challenges at all, or anything that you want to sort of share in the conversation aside from questions, then do use the chat function, as many of you are already doing. Thank you. And although you won't be able to come off mute due to the size and the setup of this event today, that chat function is how we can have dialogue, and myself, colleagues and the speakers will be monitoring it. So I think that's it in terms of the housekeeping and the admin. And yeah, just a couple of quick introductory comments from me. We'll be talking about creating an effective board, and that's always an important topic, but perhaps especially so in today's unsettled world. We know that charity boards need to adapt, to take risks, and to balance the short-term pressures that they face against longer-term goals and that kind of mission and impact focus that they need to have. And to do that effectively, this kind of complicated, nuanced thing, trustees need to be able to work together in ways which enable good discussions, deliberation, high quality decision making. And they need to build boards with the right skills, including a close understanding of the issue that the charity works on, so that there's, I guess, heart as well as head in the decisions that you're taking, a good balance of the two. So today we're going to be talking about relationships and boundaries, the boundaries between trustees and the executive, and how those individuals ultimately work together. But we'll also be talking about processes, about the structures that you can put in place to support and scaffold those good relationships, that good communication. We'll be talking about staying impact focused and managing risks and avoiding pitfalls. And they're all themes that we wrote about recently in a publication, which again was supported by the Clothworkers, which is called Being a Trustee in an Age of Permacrisis. And in that publication, we talked a lot about getting access to the right range of input and insights, in understanding whether that's from, well, hopefully both from data and research, balanced with the voices of the people that you're working with and their lived experience. We wrote about putting mission above organisation when a shifting world leads you to consider, well, what is it that we can do to make the biggest difference now that the circumstance is different, and thinking about things that were perhaps previously unthinkable in addressing that. My thinking on this has also been really influenced by some great work which MPC did during the pandemic with the decision science consultancy Leapwise. It's called Charity Boards in Recovery, and again, I think a link will go in the chat. But it's really practical, it's really grounded and kind of action orientated about how to take good decisions. And it's got a focus about in an online world and that kind of new environment that we were navigating in the pandemic. Many of us are still in that world. But even aside from the kind of online dynamic, there's really sound, concrete advice on preparing useful documentation, running effective meetings, and really ensuring that you have the best quality of discussion within the time that you're dedicating. So I'd really encourage you to look at that. But I know a lot of those things that are on my mind when I think about this topic are also very strongly on the minds of our speakers. And so I'm really happy now to hand over the sort of microphone to them and let them share their experiences. So firstly, I'm delighted to introduce Kit Beesley. Kit is the Chair of Trustees at the Finance Innovation Lab, and that's a charity which builds power to transform the financial system for people and planet. He's also a trustee of the Nationwide Foundation. He's a chartered accountant by trade, and he's spent most of his career in financial services. I believe, although I don't want to muffle you at all, but I believe Kit's going to talk to us about where you can find resources on effective trusteeship, where to go for advice, and some of the key elements to build into your board's practice to improve the way it works. Thanks so much, Kit. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Sally. Yeah, hello. Can we have the slides up? Okay, lovely. So my brief is to talk about reviewing your governance and understanding what's working or needs improving, and also to suggest some practical ways in which boards can improve their discussions, decision-making and learning. So I'm going to cover 3 areas. So on the next slide, the first is to draw your attention to, as Sally has already pointed out, but the many free resources available to run charities, but mainly to encourage you to use them. Secondly, I'll talk a little bit about some relevant parts of the Charity Governance Code, and then I'm going to suggest some things to think about before, during and after meetings, particularly board meetings, to help the board do its job effectively. Next slide, please. So, right, free resources. So there are some links in the slide, and I think they'll be made available to you. Firstly, the Charity Commission website has got lots of free guidance. It's really geared to what you must or must not do to comply with the rules that apply to charities and maintaining your charitable status. The Charity Governance Code is also quite sort of governance related. It's much about the key aspects of governance you should have in place, why they should be there, what it covers. And you can use that as a quite useful checklist for assessing how your own charity sort of measures up. It's also got a really good useful links page, which takes you to even more guidance and practical help. So I would suggest formally and regularly considering how you measure up against each part of the code to look for where you might improve. And on that theme, the NPC and the NCVO have a lot more guidance about the sort of the how to do it, the how to do the things that you have to do, like running meetings, running effective meetings, managing conflicts of interest, getting the most from your fellow trustees. And my suggestion on all of this is don't try to learn it all, but think about areas that you need to look at, either for you or for your charity board, and look for the guidance on those topics as and when you need it. So the next slide, I was going to look at specific aspects of the Charity Governance Code. So there are 7 areas with specific expectations of the board, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just wanted to highlight a few that I think are really relevant to the effectiveness of a board and of its meetings. So the first of all is it's kind of obvious, but number 2 is leadership. So highlighting the importance of an effective board. And what it actually says is every charity should be headed by an effective board that provides strategic leadership in line with the charity's aims and values. And so in terms of building that, number 4 is about decision-making, risk and control. And I would say this is about good meetings. It's about good minutes, which record decisions and active actions clearly for effective follow-up. It's about having the right committees or working groups for your size of charity, whether they're formal or informal. It's about having clear delegated authorities, either to management or to subcommittees, and having the right control and reporting processes in place and operating effectively. So that's very much about a process, a sort of, management process. And then the third one that I wanted to draw attention to is number 5, which is board effectiveness. Kind of answers the implicit question under the first one, under leadership, of what is an effective board anyway. I just want to make 3 points on this one. First, the importance of having the right people on the board. So at the Finance Innovation Lab, we talk to the lab team about the skills and the experience that they need the board to have so that the board can offer support and ask the right questions and provide the right level of informed challenge based on the work that the lab is going to be doing as they implement the strategy. And we do a skills audit of the board to compare the board's skills and experience with those needs, plus the governance needs of the board. And then we use that to inform our recruitment of new trustees and the training of existing trustees by looking at the gaps. Secondly, I'd say it's the role of everybody on the board to work as part of a team, bringing their knowledge, their experience and attention to the meetings and working with the other trustees to get the best out of each other. The chair can help and facilitate that, but it won't work unless everybody plays their part. And the third thing I'd like to mention under board effectiveness is the importance of thinking of the board as part of the overall charity team with the executive and the others working in the charity. So the board has a specific strategic and governance and oversight role, but it's also a valuable source of expertise, experience, contacts for the team, and it can be a useful sounding board. So for this support role to work, you need good communication channels between the board and the team, a clear understanding of the boundaries of the board's role and who has ultimate decision-making authority in any given situation. And then finally, I would just mention number 7, openness and accountability. So in the Charity Governance Code, this is really about external openness and accountability, but I think it also applies internally, because part of being an effective board is having an open and effective working relationship with the team, collaborating and communicating, but always knowing where those boundaries are and being able to have an open and honest discussion if that's ever unclear. So the next slide, I just wanted to look at what happens before, during and after board meetings to make them really effective. And so here are some suggestions for things to think about before a board meeting. So these are key events at which the board of the charity performs its functions of providing leadership, strategic direction and oversight. And for that to really work, there are some things that need to happen beforehand. First, I've already talked about board composition, but basically without the right people in the room, you won't be able to have the right discussions, ask the right questions, or make informed decisions. But if you don't have the right skills and experience on the board, you should consider getting professional advice on specific topics, or maybe get voluntary or professional board advisors for specific topics. Don't be afraid to ask for extra expertise to help you make the right decisions. Secondly, in fact, there is a legal requirement, I believe, on trustees to seek professional advice if they need it. Secondly, having a clear agenda with the right topics on it. So in my role as chair at the Finance Innovation Lab, I use an informal subgroup of trustees, which is me plus the vice chairs plus the executive, and we agree the agenda. We discuss and agree the right balance of governance versus strategy to make sure that we cover the essential governance topics, but also making sure there's time for discussion about strategy, updates for the team, any key issues or risks the team needs to bring to the board's attention. We also make sure it's clear for each item, whether it's for approval, information, board discussion, or a decision, so that the board members all know what is expected of them in those discussions. And we put times against each of the items to ensure the appropriate amount of time is dedicated to each one. And then finally, the board papers themselves need to be relevant, understandable, and the right length, not too long or too detailed, but enough to tell the trustees what they need to know. And the trustees need to read them before the meeting. So next slide. The next slide, thanks. So during the board meeting, of course, what happens during the meeting is also crucial to the effectiveness of that meeting and of the board itself. So clearly the role of the chair is to take a lead in this, but as a chair, I would say, please don't put all the responsibility on the chair, because everybody on the board can contribute. First thing I would highlight is encouraging participation. There's no point in having the right people, experience and skills around the table if they never get the chance to contribute. Don't be afraid to ask people to be brief, to give time for others to speak, or to specifically ask people to contribute, especially if you know that they may have relevant experience or insights, or if they're one of the more reticent or less confident trustees. Also, don't hog the conversation, even if you're the chair, and be conscious of the timings given on the agenda. Try to keep to the times you agreed, because those times reflect the importance of the topics and you need to leave time for the important ones. If necessary, stop the conversation and defer for another time, or delegate it to a subgroup for further work. And don't overrun for the meeting as a whole. It's not fair on people who are volunteering their time. Then I suppose recently we've had to get more used to using virtual meetings, but bear in mind the extra effort and different techniques for ensuring effective contributions from people, depending on whether it's virtual or in person. And if it's hybrid, be really disciplined with those who are in the room, not to talk over each other, because that makes it really hard to hear for those people who are remote. And try to turn to the camera and make those joining remotely feel included. Look out for when they're trying to speak and bring them into the conversation, whether you're the chair or not, because quite often in my experience, it's very easy for the chair to be focusing on people in the room and see where the sort of signals are coming from. And sometimes you need somebody else in the room to spot when one of the people online wants to chip in. And then finally, relevant and understandable minutes are essential. They need to record the key points raised in discussion, not a verbatim list of what everybody said, but just the key points. What was noted as having been seen by the board, what was approved or not, what actions are to be taken, by whom and by when, and they should be followed up at every board meeting. And then one more slide. Finally, after the meeting, seek feedback and learn lessons. So I do this at a chairs meeting, that group, that sort of informal subgroup. But I also do it in a one-to-one with the lab's chief executive, Jessie. So we have a quick chat, what worked, what didn't work, and so on. You could consider a survey. So we do a quick survey monkey at the end of each board meeting to check whether people felt that the meeting was effective and whether they felt able to contribute effectively. And so we can learn lessons from that. And make sure that you look at the minutes. And this is not just the chair's role, this is everybody. Make sure you look at the minutes to check they actually record what happened, what was decided, and so on. So, and then the final slide is just a reminder of those three broad areas that I talked about. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kit. That's such a brilliant way to start. And a few different things that you talked about there that really resonated with me. One of them is when you're thinking about meeting dynamics, that sort of shared responsibility for supporting quieter voices, and conversely, maybe having the self-knowledge to, I've heard people call it share the air, and make sure that you kind of hold yourself back if you know you've got a tendency to speak a lot. Really useful practical stuff on the etiquette for hybrid meetings. I think a lot of us will have been on the challenging end of being remote, while a lot of people do have an in-room dynamic. And that kind of closing the feedback loop of just a bit of reflective practice. Was it good? How did it work for everybody? So really lots to think about there. Really appreciate it. A quick apology or correction to everybody who is with us and listening. I am wrong. There is no Q&A function. Just all of your questions straight into the chat. That makes it a bit easier and more streamlined in some ways. So do share your questions for Kit, or your thoughts that his presentation have inspired in the chat, or if you prefer to, I think if you put your hand up, we'll be able to come to you. But I'll take chair's prerogative since I have the opportunity. And I thought it's really nice the comments that you were making about building a dynamic where the staff and trustees feel like one team rather than two teams. And I think in practice that's quite hard to achieve when everybody's busy. The staff team are extremely busy, and everybody's very tries to be very, I think, respectful of trustees as volunteers, not having endless time to give to this. But I'm just interested to hear, have you seen it done well? What have you seen make that work really well, that feeling of being in one team, being one team?
I actually think it works really well both at the lab and at the Nationwide Foundation. And I was just trying to think, as you were saying that, I was trying to think, why is that? And I think the answer is because there's a willingness on both sides. So
Yeah.
so both of the teams recognize and appreciate both the time that's given by the trustees, but also the expertise that they bring. They're very careful not to sort of over demand, but always to be open to participation by trustees if they want to. So the lab, all the trustees will know about some of the events that the lab is holding, and they're very welcome to turn up to those and be a part of the audience, but a sort of an informed part of the audience and participating. So I've done several of those, and they're really useful. They're really useful networking events. They're really useful for finding out more about what the lab is doing. And the same with the Nationwide Foundation. There are events that that you can go to. But I think I can imagine that in some situations you might have let's say a very defensive chief executive who's very kind of feeling, actually, this is my baby, you're there, you're over there, you do the governance stuff and you tell us that the strategy is fine and we really don't want an argument about that. But otherwise, kind of, you do your governance bit and we'll do the practical bit. So a lot of it is probably down to personalities. I think that doesn't make the best use of trustees and the skills that they might bring.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. I think one of the other things that I was thinking about while you were talking is it's on a similar theme, actually. I think is that the governance role, the governance role is a formal role. It's a kind of role that's defined by law. There's a responsibility on trustees to deliver it, to fulfill their duties. And I think it can create quite a formal structure, quite a formal feeling to some of the meetings. And I was interested to hear the way that you talk about the informal subgroup that you've got, the kind of reflection session that you sometimes have with the chief exec afterwards. And I just wondered about that balance between formality and informality in the effective in kind of creating an effective board dynamics and processes. Is that something that you've kind of reflected on? What do you think works kind of well in balancing those two?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think there is I suppose I have an advantage because my training as a chartered accountant, so for 30 something years, it's just been drilled into me about the concept of independence, but also having to work with people. So I think there's a sort of, some people probably find that quite hard, and they have to be in one box or the other, and it's sort of like, right, now I'm in kind of governance box and I'm not going to be friendly. I'm going to very much by the book. It's the rules and this is what we've got to do. But I think that if you're confident in knowing what those rules are and what those requirements are, you can do that in a way that actually also allows friendly participation.
Yeah.
But you do have to recognize that formality. There are certain things you have to do. And that's why I made the point about the minutes. There are certain things that you need recorded in the minutes, because otherwise it's going to be really hard to remember what it was that you said or agreed was going to be done. It's really hard to hold somebody account for it if it hasn't been done. And you waste time going back over decisions because it wasn't clear what the decision was the last time round, and you end up just having the whole discussion all over again, which is just a waste of time. So it's kind of but you don't have to be a kind of a really unfriendly, you don't have to have a really unfriendly approach to do that. Do you see what I mean? So
Absolutely.
And then but there's recognizing those boundaries. So So the chairs meeting is not a formal meeting, and we're very clear to the rest of the board. It has no decision-making capability. It's just a sounding board. It's just a place for discussion. If something comes out of it that might need a discussion at board, we'll have that discussion at the board. But it's kind of already got a set of, the parameters of that discussion can be clarified by having that discussion first.
Yeah. Makes sense, absolutely. And I suppose one of the things I'm hearing from that is, well, one of the basic things is these two things do need to be held together. They don't need to be in tension, but there is a kind of need to navigate the balance between them. And I think the way you started here is really interesting. Just to kind of reiterate, is it's almost like you're talking about scaffolding your confidence to be friendly with a real kind of strong knowledge of what the expectations and needs are. And so there's that you were kind of talking about the kind of core guidance and I guess some of the kind of professional development such as this as being a really important foundation to be able to have that kind of friendly and informal conversation, because it's sort of scaffolded with that knowledge about what you need to cover, I guess.
Yeah. And you've always got in the background that knowledge of and we talked about boundaries, and I'm sure it'll come up again, but in different situations those boundaries can be more or less challenging. So if you've got if everything's running smoothly and everybody knows what they're doing, and you haven't got funding challenges or issues with particular team members or something like that, then actually it's easy. I guess where it gets more challenging is where you've got, so for instance, if you were having I don't know, challenges around the sort of the executive, and for some reason trustees with particular expertise needed to take a closer involvement in order to get through a situation, that's where you need to be really, really conscious about how you step back again afterwards, and how and what decision-making authority are you doing? How do you leave the right decisions with the executive? To what extent do those need to be taken away and given to the board again? Because they are only delegated authorities. So there is, you just have to know that. And there's probably quite a fine line, or there's a knowledge, there's a self-awareness that you need when you're having to give support in a really difficult situation, which might require you to kind of get a bit more, I don't know, friendly or personal, or sort of more mentorish with somebody to get them through the situation, but then to kind of make sure that you can step back to that going back to that sort of governance role that you have to have the whole time.
I think that's a really good point. And as you say, I'm sure something that we'll talk about a bit more, that sort of making sure you can stay strategic, but as you say, step forward to support and then back again into that strategic role as needed. Really interesting. Thanks, Kit. There's a brilliant question in the chat, which I'm not going to direct to you now, Kit, because I think it's going to be really interesting to come to once we've heard all of our presentations. And it's from James, who says, how do you know when you're doing it well? And there's a kind of longer comment, but it's about when do you know what you don't know? It feels good, everybody's friendly, nothing seems to be going wrong, but are we being complacent? Are we finding our blind spots? And some kind of thinking on this from MPC, my colleague Katie's shared. But yeah, let's come back to that after all three presentations, because I think that's a great discussion. Thanks, Kit. I'd like to introduce our next speaker and that's Sonu Shenai. And Sonu is an investment director and employment lead at Impetus, where she coaches and supports charity leaders working to improve employment outcomes among young people. She has years of leadership experience in the charity sector, including as chief executive of the Funding Network. She's a trustee of the John Lyons charity, I think a serial trustee, I understand, but currently of the John Lyons charity, and also a school governor. And really, really pleased that Sonu will be talking to us today, I think, about what it means for boards to be impact focused and keeping that mission focus, and how to stay strategic and avoid some of the common pitfalls, which might include the one we were just talking about. So thanks so much, Sonu. I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks so much, Sally. Hi, everyone. It's great to meet you. Thanks so much for joining us for this really important topic. And thank you, Gillian, for the slides. I'll just wait for the first one to load. Well, welcome. And yes, as Sally said, I'm a serial trustee. I'm really passionate about leadership and governance. I've been on a variety of boards, and I also have the perspective of working with a board as a chief exec myself. In my day job, I work at Impetus, where we work shoulder to shoulder with the leadership teams of 25 charities, all of whom are helping young people from disadvantaged backgrounds to thrive. And so I'm approaching this from the lens mainly of the work I do at Impetus, but also through my wider knowledge. So what at Impetus, when we talk about impact, what do we mean by impact? And so we think of this as 5 separate things, really. The first is that the work you're doing is socially meaningful. It wouldn't otherwise have happened. It's measurable. It beats benchmarks of other organizations trying to do work in this sector, and it's durable. So it carries on. It leaves a real mark on the people that you're trying to serve. The problem is, of course, it's really difficult to know what would have happened without your charity's support, but it's a really important lens for making decisions on how you work and how you prioritize. So, for example, if your charity is providing careers advice to students, to be really impactful, you would want to be providing your service to students who need it and who aren't already receiving excellent careers advice. You'd want to be delivering a service that's tailored to the needs of the people you serve, their age group, the context they're in. And finally, you want to be helping them make better choices than they would otherwise have been able to make and have access to careers they wouldn't otherwise have had. So that's just one example. And of course, in the drug world, they're much better at this because they can do randomized control trials and they can do placebos, and they have a number of different ways of really measuring impact. But I think it's still a really important lens for us all to retain on the difference that we can be making through our work. Going on to my next slide, I'm going to talk about how we see the role that boards can play. So the first bullet point here is really about the duty of the board, and that's to ensure that your charity is really delivering on its mission and it's making really meaningful outcomes the ultimate basis for deciding how you make a difference. Secondly, good governance requires focus on direction as well as sustainability of your charity and your impact ambition. It's really important to work with your team, with your executive team, to drive to those meaningful outcomes for the people you serve. Boards are custodians of the mission. Of course, the executive team can change. Chief executives can leave, and you might have to recruit a new chief exec. And that's why you can play a really vital role in ensuring continuity or a change of direction. And finally, your understanding and ownership of the mission is essential to the contribution of this charity, and including the way that you can contribute, of course, includes raising funds and building the charity's brand, as well as providing a strategic perspective. Over onto the next slide, I'm going to talk about impact capabilities and board effectiveness. The first box at the top with the orange circles really just defines what I mean about the board's role on impact. So it's to shape the mission, so set that strategic direction and align on the social purpose of the charity. It's to shape the plan for delivering the services you provide. It's to review performance, learn what's working and why, and improve what isn't. Again, linking to the point about complacency asked earlier. And finally, it's supporting the CEO and senior team with development and recruitment to sustain the work you do. In order to provide this kind of focus, this requires a board to feel real responsibility for impact, have a really deep understanding of delivery, and bring relevant expertise, as Kit said, bringing knowledge, but also as a team to work effectively together. We would encourage an annual planning cycle with impact built into it and reflection from the team on what's working, how things are going, and create space for respectful conversations on how to move forwards. This is so important for really understanding the difference you're making and how it could be even better. Over onto the next slide, I talk about common pitfalls. And I say this with real empathy from having experienced a lot of them myself and been in situations where I've seen them happen. And the first one is don't fall in love with your chief executive. I mean this slightly jokingly, but of course this can happen because we can be so appreciative of the work that chief executives are doing. They're doing a really hard job and they really need appreciation. But they also need help to learn and develop. Ultimately, as trustees, you are all accountable for the work of your charity. So it's really important to maintain appropriate curiosity, as well as ensuring focus on delivery of meaningful outcomes. This is sort of referring, we heard Kit and Sally also talk about this earlier, and I like to think of it as a sort of seesaw of support and challenge. The next pitfall is don't do your team's work. And this, again, can be an issue for smaller charities where trustees can quite understandably get drawn into operational issues. It's really important not to be able to, not to get over-involved in delivery so that you can maintain that strategic perspective. So clarifying and maintaining boundaries between the board and the executive team is really important. Where charities are smaller, board members can get operationally involved, as I said, but I would encourage this to be really boundaried around discrete short-term projects rather than ongoing delivery. So for example, being involved in the recruitment of a specific director level role rather than ongoing HR function issues. The next pitfall is, again, linking to the point about complacency. Don't think that the status quo is the only way. Boards really need to guard against groupthink and bias for effective learning and risk mitigation. And this is, I think, something that our next speaker will be speaking about. Boards need to be able to have healthy debate and kind of clarify, question and discuss and bring fresh ideas and perspective. But this has got to feel safe. Once I was in a trustees meeting personally, and I asked a question, and one of the other trustees immediately said, "Why would you say that? Don't you trust our chief executive?" And I felt that that was just a sort of over-personalization, because all I was doing was trying to clarify why and help us to think about different ways through the problem rather than landing at one solution. And so linking back to Kit's point, I really like the idea of a check-in, so that if people are brave enough to bring challenge, that they can feel that they are adequately supported in doing that and don't feel that they are the villain or that they feel personally attacked, and can maintain the appropriate boundary. The next pitfall is not forgetting about the outside world, and boards can get very drawn into internal issues and delivery and governance internally. So it's really important to have at least an annual focus thinking about external context and how it's changing, so you can have the best impact and continue to be relevant for service users today, as well as the service users that you served last year. And think also, of course, about the service users you may be working with next year. A number of different charities, for example, working with young people, are having to support on more safeguarding issues than ever before. And this kind of perspective has helped, can help them think about future service delivery. So one charity, for example, that I know has responded by creating a new post of designated safeguarding lead within their organisation that they never needed before. But this will now bring expertise and focus to future work. And the final pitfall is not to lose touch with the lives you're changing. I think everyone who's ever been on a board knows that governance can sometimes feel like a slog, like really hard work, really important, but can be really difficult and challenging. So it's really important to remember why you're doing this and the lives you're changing as a result, and also to celebrate all the hard work that has gone into making those changes. And so on that note, I'd like to hand back to Sally and encourage you all, and thank you for your hard work.
Thanks so much, Sonu. And please do pop your questions for Sonu in the chat. Yeah, keen to hear what's on your mind and what's resonated, what you're kind of interested to hear more about there. But Sonu, you began your presentation with that framing around kind of governance for mission and staying impact oriented. And I guess, you know, similar, I suppose, to my earlier question, which is around kind of respecting time and respecting kind of, the kind of headspace of your trustees. What have you seen as kind of useful information or data that trustees need to see or have access to stay impact oriented without getting kind of caught into too deep in the day-to-day? I think it's one of the ongoing challenges of measurement and evaluation, and we think about this a lot, which is making sure that you have that balance of impact-oriented data tracking and kind of KPI data tracking and sort of running the organization and making sure that you're a going concern and all of that kind of financial risk management. So where you've seen boards that you've been on or in the organizations you've supported balance that kind of organizational data tracking and the impact data tracking, what's that look like? You know, what can people think about taking to their organizations from the good practice you've seen?
I think it's a really interesting question. And the answer is it will depend on the size of the charity. I think it's got to be really appropriate for the size of the organization. So you wouldn't, it takes effort for executive teams to service boards. And so it's really important to think about what's the right balance to be struck. And of course, it is definitely very useful for all board members to have information before the meeting and to be kind of appropriately informed about how the charity is delivering on its mission and the kind of work that is being done and whether KPIs, if they have been set, are being hit. What that can look like will vary for each charity. And obviously, if you're a charity the size of the NSPCC, that is different from if you're a charity with 10 staff members. So it has to be really appropriate. I think the other thing that can be really useful is to move beyond numbers and papers written by the executive team and also think about the voices of your service users. So some boards can have, for example, advisory groups or stakeholders with lived experience feeding into the board somehow, and that could be a really relevant source of information to know how your service users are being supported and the value that they're gaining and understand their experience.
That's brilliant. And in fact, you've just answered one of my other questions, which I'll just pose in case you or anyone in the chat has other thoughts they want to share on this, which is you talked about staying in touch with the lives that you're changing and that, you know, you've talked about a kind of governance mechanism for staying in touch. And MPC did a previous Clothworkers event. My colleagues might be able to hurriedly find the link, which is about weaving lived experience into boards, which I wasn't part of at all, but I watched back and it was really, really kind of affecting and useful to think about the journey that those organisations have been on to get it wrong and then get it right, actually. But just interested in any other examples you've had or any other things you've seen effective in terms of bringing that voice and that understanding of the lives that you're ultimately there, you know, the people you're ultimately there to serve into the governance conversation. Any other kind of examples or things people could build on there?
Sure, yes. Obviously, you could have boards or kind of shadow boards of your service users, but you could also have annual surveys. Again, it depends on how many people are being supported by your charity. So what might feel appropriate will vary. And so if it's more like thousands of people that you're serving, you might want to consider an annual survey, for example, and kind of mechanisms by which people can contribute anonymously, as well as getting kind of qualitative case studies, which would also give you a really good sense of the journeys that people are having with your charity, and also what happens after. So the effect that you've had on their life after they've left, and hopefully that has endured and created some sort of step change for them. Yeah, I mean, so for example, in the previous example of the young person going through a careers advice service, for them to have accessed, for example, information that enabled them to make a really strong application to university, and then they got to go to university, and then they found a job after university, for that charity to hear that, that would be wonderful information, because you would feel like, you know, that had gone well for that person. Yeah. So I think understanding that can be really valuable, but equally it can also be it is really important to know when things haven't worked out well. And so if someone has started that same transition and made that application to university, but it hasn't worked, and they have now found themselves in a place where they are not able to go to university, then why? What has happened? Have they struggled in some way, or have they had a problem getting the student finance together? In which case, perhaps that's a piece of information you could have woven into the service you provide. So it's a very small example, but that's how that kind of non-completion information can help charities to understand effectiveness and think about what could change in the future.
That's brilliant, thank you. And I think it speaks to a question which is in the chat, which I'll make the last one before we move on, although there's another couple of themes which I'm going to bring into the last discussion session, including that balance between kind of support and challenge. I think it'd be nice to come back to that, but a more concrete one for now.
Could I say one thing about support versus challenge? Like,
please.
I absolutely agree that, it's not to say that support isn't important. As I said, it's so hard being a charity chief executive, particularly in today's climate where fundraising is harder than ever, and probably service users, depending on what sector you work in, but I'm going to make a guess that a lot of service users have been very, very negatively impacted by the pandemic, and I'm sure need the services of your charities more than ever. So I really think, of course, please do support your chief executives, and they need that. But they also need the support to improve and think about what might be lurking around the corner for them and your charities. And that's the challenge. So I don't mean anything particularly hostile or attacking. I mean to help them think about things they might not have considered, or to show appropriate curiosity in how things are going.
And it's a mirror of what you said, I think, about the impact measurement. You learn as much from the cases that didn't continue in the way that you hoped. It doesn't mean that you did it wrong, but it might be a learning point of what you could do to kind of increase your chances of long-term success in the future.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I will take the liberty of just one more question on the impact measurement kind of theme, which is from Agnes. And she says, what do you say is the goal of impact measurement? And if it's to make it useful for donors, do you endeavour to use standardised criteria like those developed by IRIS? Or if not that, what are the useful standards? So yeah, just kind of speaking to the purpose of impact measurement and how you choose which approach to take.
Well, donors are obviously very, very important to charities in maintaining long-term financial sustainability. But I think the real impact of goal measurement is to be better at doing what you're doing for the lives you're changing. So it's to do it well, to learn what's working, and to think about how it could be even better. And that story is worth it in itself for your service users, but will be extremely useful also to your donors to learn how they can make a difference by supporting your charity rather than all the other causes that are equally valuable out there.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody who's contributing in the chat. I won't read it all out because it doesn't feel like the best use of time, but some interesting examples around involving service users in trustee recruitment, and this kind of this conversation around constructive challenge is kind of live for people, I think. So thank you so much, Sonu. That's been really, really interesting and instructive, and we'll hopefully chat further after our third presentation. So I'm now really delighted to introduce you to Sharn Abdullah. And Sharn is the finance trustee for the Thalidomide Trust, which is an organisation providing support and compensation to those affected by thalidomide. Sharn's professional background is in pensions at BT, where he specialises in implementing effective governance and risk frameworks. And he's also the founder of the Diversity in Pensions initiative. So I'm really delighted that Sharn is here to kind of bring his sort of dual perspective of the corporate world and the charity board perspective. And I think that Sharn will be chatting to us about ways to manage risks with respect to the different needs of the executive and the trustee team, as well as thinking about how to navigate and plan for unexpected events and kind of manage kind of unconscious bias in the way that you plan for the future and think about your risks. So Sharn, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sally. As Sally said, I'm Sharn Abdullah. I work for BT, but I'm also a trustee of the Thalidomide Trust. I have experience of managing risk from a number of perspectives. I've been doing this for over a decade and a half, helping organisations, and I've lived it from the angle of a consultant when I was at PwC, from the angle of a large corporate, from the angle of a charity, but also from the angle of pension schemes, and there's quite a lot of governance involved there. And some of the thinking that I'll share is all about how do you manage the balance between what the board needs versus what the executive needs. Good risk management uses data and inputs to enable better decisions to be made. And it looks beyond the now. It's looking on the horizon of what could come, what could throw us off plan. But the problem is that if you have too much data and too much information, that can sometimes be a bad thing. And I'll show you a way that I use to cut through all of that excessive data, and hopefully it'll help you to have some more focused trustee board meetings. Could we move to the next slide, please? So let's just start with what bad governance looks like and bad risk management. It usually ends up breaking organizations, and in some cases it can even make some big headlines, a bit like the SVB bank. If we move to the next slide, you'll see some examples of good risk management. Well, there aren't any. It's very much just a silent thing that happens behind the scenes, but it rarely gets a mention. And today I want to share some of my insights on how to do that governance better in a way that recognizes that balance between the board and the exec, managing that boundary, but then enabling that challenge back to the exec, and having some substantive conversations. And all of that journey requires a little bit of a mindset shift. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. My mantra is visions and processes define success, not the goals themselves. One of the most common New Year resolutions that you get is people wanting to get back into shape. And given how long those have been around and how old people typically are while they're still making those New Year resolutions, you'd have thought that there wouldn't be that many unfit people left in the world. But often we never get there, or we get fit, but then we revert back to where we were. And that's because we only plan for what we hope will happen, but not what could go wrong. Navigating that unexpected cake temptation requires a plan. If you're skipping lunch or if you're sleep deprived from last night's binge watching of Netflix, chances are all of the efforts that you do just won't help you get into shape. And our ability to manage the risks in our organization effectively underpins success there as well. It's fundamental to strategic process and strategic progress, and performance, and planning for the things that go wrong, but acknowledging that not everything is in our control. And that's especially true now as we live in this age of permacrisis, moving seamlessly from one crisis to another. We have the COVID pandemic, the Ukraine war, the US banking crisis, the cost of living crisis. It's just never ending. And it makes it really hard to focus on the vision of what we want to achieve. What I have here is an extract from the World Health Organization's website. Now, it's safe to assume that most surgeons, through their training, know how to prep for surgery. It should become second nature, given that that's what they're doing every single day. You wash your hands, you put on your gown, you make sure that you've given your patient anesthetic. But there's plenty of evidence to show that having a checklist, just ticking off everything that you should have done, even if it only says the things we already know, is beneficial. And in 2008, the WHO introduced this surgical safety checklist. And over the subsequent years, that reduced complications and mortalities in surgery by over 30%. It wasn't doing anything new. It wasn't telling surgeons anything different to what they'd already been trained in. It wasn't revolutionary. It was just a simple checklist. And I'll come back to how this can help later when running trustee meetings. We can move on to the next slide. The traditional risk register. Hopefully, this is something that most of us are familiar with. Typically a very comprehensive document, long list of things that we're worried about, sometimes with some sort of structure, sometimes not. Perhaps there's some sort of assessment of the risk by how likely it is, whether it's a high, medium, low impact, sometimes not really defining what high means. Could it be 100K? Could it be 1 million? Could it be 10 million? Sometimes it's quite subjective. And then it just lists out everything that we're doing to mitigate that risk. And sometimes still captures one-off activity we did a few years ago that may no longer be relevant. And it's not something that we're doing actively, but it's something that we did, so we might as well capture it all for good governance. And for most board members, it's a compliance document. Good governance requires it, so it's done, but it doesn't help us make better decisions. It only captures what we've discussed and what we're doing. And it's typically the last thing on the agenda. It's given a few minutes of airtime and nodded through. And for me personally, it's the most effective thing at putting me to sleep in a nice deep sleep. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So one of the first things I do when I'm appointed to a board is to introduce a slightly different approach to risk frameworks. We break the risk register into 3 categories and look at each of these categories differently. There's some risks that will always be there. These are things like financial fraud, data breaches, not complying with legislation. These are persistent risks that we need to come up with processes to manage. They won't change much over time, and chances are every time we look at the risk register, it will largely be unchanged. But these types of risks usually take up the most space on a risk register. And for a board, seeing a detailed list of these every meeting doesn't add much value. And the huge list means that you're so overwhelmed with irrelevant information that you miss out on focusing on the important stuff. Then you have current risks. These are things that are happening in the here and now, the curveballs to our best laid plans. They're the things that keep us awake at night, and so they're the things that we should be talking about in every meeting. That in modern times, that could be things like the Suez Canal becoming unusable and leading to shipping delays. It could be a PR issue. It could be the cost of living crisis and the impact that that's having on the team. And then there's horizon risks. And these are things that could happen in the future. And these may be a bit fuzzier. This could be something like the industry talking about changes to governance processes coming through, or changes in legislation at some point in the future. We don't know when or some of the details of what might happen or the impact, but these are things that we want to keep an eye on. And I'll look at how we end up reporting each of these differently as trustee board level. Could we move on to the next slide, please? So with persistent risks, we ended up being quite radical and hitting the delete button on all of the detail. In this example, we have 32 risks on the risk register that we said were persistent risks. They'll always be there. And behind the scenes, there were at least 5 processes for each of those risks that we said that we're basically having to mitigate the risk. And then what we did instead was we aggregated them into a number of themes. We agreed the level of risk we were willing to take, our appetite, and we used metrics to monitor the actual exposure against our appetite, pre-agreeing what an acceptable range was and what it wasn't. Like how much spare cash could be accessed at short notice. We didn't want too much in the bank in case the bank collapses or it's just being used ineffectively, but we didn't want too little in the bank either. And this provided an early warning that something could be going wrong. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. Then what we did was we agreed a checklist of all the processes to manage the risks. But rather than going through the entire list every meeting, we moved to reporting which processes weren't working well since we last met. And that's what we have on the right-hand side. So we have, for each of our categories of risk, governance, financial, legal, resourcing, and other risks, we had five processes to manage all of our low risks, and we had 7 processes to manage all of our medium risks, and so on and so forth. And rather than focusing on all of the things that were going fine, we could end up focusing on what wasn't going fine. And there was a medium risk, a medium financial risk, where one of the processes wasn't working well, and that popped out pretty neatly on the risk register. And to support all of this, what you need is the executive doing all of the thinking behind the scenes, managing that risk register, thinking about what's going on, what things aren't working well, what things are working well. And that then allowed the board to focus on 3 questions. Are we on plan? How many of our processes are working as we expected? Are the metrics within our appetite range? Or have we been thrown off track? Are there any processes where we need to get involved at a board level? What are the issues that we didn't anticipate and what caused them? And therefore, are we comfortable that the executive team is doing the right thing to resolve those and to make sure they don't happen again? Do we need to change our plans? Did we learn anything as a result of those failures that we need to change? And if we can move on to the next slide, please. And one more, sorry. And therefore, having that summary of these are the key things that we should be talking about at the board level meant that we condensed 32 risks on a risk register, which took up about 5 pages, all onto one very simple dashboard. And then we could actually have a very structured conversation on, is the executive looking at the right things? Is there a risk that could be coming down the line that we need to be thinking about even more than we are already? Can we move on to the next slide, please? So looking at the horizon risks, these were things that could happen in the future. Looking at the current risks and issues, here we'd go through the traditional thinking. We'd rate each of the risks by speed and by impact and test whether or not there was anything more we could be doing to manage that risk. In this example, we had 2 risks, which we said were highly likely, one really big and one medium-sized risk. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. And a summary provided by the exec meant that, again, you could have a very focused conversation about some of the proposed actions that the exec had already looked at, and then discussion at the board level was really, are these the right actions? Are the right decisions being taken? Do we have the right processes in place? Are we appropriately worried about these risks, or should we be doing something even more? Or actually, are we getting overly worried about these risks and actually we can do something less? And then on the next slide, we have horizon risks. So these are things that could happen in the future. Say there's talk in the industry about governance changing. We don't know when or some of the details, but these are all things that we want to keep an eye on. And maybe we even want to try and influence some of that discussion in the industry, depending on our organization and the impact it could have. However, does the trustee board need to know all of these, or is it just good governance that the executive team has their own register of things they're looking at? And maybe some of the biggest things that they think are then brought out and discussed at the board level. So what? I guess to summarize, because we went from a risk register that was 10 pages long in this example to something that was really focused, 3 very simple slides, it meant that the discussion at the trustee board naturally meant that the risk register moved to the top of the agenda because it captured everything that the trustees needed to talk about and everything that was urgent. And therefore, it provided a better framework for each of our meetings. And it meant that we were able to better focus on issues that mattered most to the beneficiaries of the charity. And with that, I'll hand back to Sally.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Shan. I've found it really, really interesting. I've sort of heard about a little bit about this approach from you kind of in conversation, but it's really useful to see you take us through it and thinking about managing risk in that different way. I love the idea of that radical move of grouping your persistent risks. I think just the kind of key insight that you skipped over quite quickly, which was talking about risk appetite. And like that basic recognition that you're not always looking for zero risk. Actually, sometimes you are netting off I guess an operational risk against an impact opportunity. And I think that's a really interesting kind of insight there. And the focus on asking questions, using the dashboard to prompt the questions like, do we need to change? Is this telling us we need to change? And what did we learn? And thereby making the risk conversation fundamental to what you're doing rather than a thing that you check at the end of the meeting. I think it's a really kind of interesting approach. I wonder if maybe a quick question for you, because that idea about risk appetite really struck me, and it's not really something that we talked about much today. Can you tell us a bit more about how you've seen your board talk about risk appetite and how they've kind of been thinking about, in some cases, not looking to minimize risk, but to manage risk? Can you share any more examples to kind of help bring that to life for everybody?
No, of course. Rather than looking at one of my trustee roles, I'm going to look at my corporate role.
Yeah.
BT has one of the largest pension schemes in the UK, and therefore it poses one of the biggest risks to BT as an organisation in terms of delivering fibre to the UK. And when I joined a decade ago, the commentary around the industry was very much, BT is not a telecoms organisation. It's a very large pension scheme with a telecoms arm attached to it. And that's something that we've changed over the last decade with our approach to risk management. But at the time, there was a discussion, well, can we not just get rid of this pensions risk? What would that take? And the size of the company, the market cap of the company at the time was about 25 billion. And the cost to get rid of the risk was 30 billion. And you're saying, well, I know I can't get rid of this risk. Therefore, it's definitely something I have to manage. And having that conversation of, well, how much money am I willing to spend to actually get rid of this? And is it worth it? Would I be able to deploy that money better elsewhere? Was the start of that journey to say, actually, no, this is a risk that we need to manage and almost use it as an opportunity to change how the industry thinks of BT.
Really interesting. Thank you. Okay, I'll invite all of our speakers back onto screen. Thanks to MPC colleagues for doing that. And we have about 20 minutes or so. So please do share your questions for our speakers in the chat function. Really keen to have a bit of conversation and to hear your reflections on the presentations that you've heard. I'm going to start, I think, for our speakers with the question, how do you know you're doing this well? Which I think James shared earlier. And he talked a little bit about complacency and the risk of complacency and all of that kind of thing, and looking out for the unknowns. But it might be that there's another kind of factor that you think, another kind of indicator for you that you're doing it well, that it's working, that it's working well. We've had a little bit of suggestion in the chat that maybe that a little bit of that constructive tension is part of it. But yeah, interested to hear your thoughts. Kit, you've had the longest to think about this. I'll come to you first.
Gosh, thanks. Well, I think there are many, there are actually many aspects to this. So one is, I would say, when you're looking for trustees, in fact, when you're recruiting anybody into a team, I guess, don't look for people who are just like you. Make sure that you get, a diversity of opinions, attitudes, experience, skills, and so on onto the team. And it's, just as, if you like, I wouldn't want to recruit somebody into my finance team who didn't feel able to challenge me and tell me I'm being stupid. I kind of, I want the same in my trustees. I noticed there are two of my fellow trustees on the call, so feel free, Emma and I can't remember who else it is. Anyway, Katie, that's right. Yeah, so Emma and Katie, don't take it too literally, but it is important that people feel able to say, what if they feel that there's a challenge to be made. So that's one thing, about encouraging it and having the people who have that background. I think this question of diversity, so diversity in all its forms, it's not always possible, it's not always easy, but I think the more diversity you have, the more likely you are to have people looking at things from different angles. So I think that's the second point I've made. And then the third one is just voices in the room. So there will be some voices you cannot get in the room for whatever reason. So maybe think about, well, how do I get those voices in the room? Is that about getting people to look into the topic, or is it about people who can validly represent those voices? Do you see what I mean? So, I mean, if you can't get service users, for instance, are there people you can get on who have a genuine experience of interaction with those service users, who might be able to represent them, if you like, on the board and provide that view, recognize that. And one of the things that we recognized a couple of years ago when we were recruiting onto the board was the difficulty of getting some, the fact that a lot of people who would give us diversity on the board might not have the confidence to come onto a board of trustees. And so what we did was we created something called Trustees in Training, and various other boards and so on have got various sort of versions of this. But basically we brought 4 really good people onto the board, not as members of the board, but as trustees in training. Their voices were heard, they were encouraged to participate, they got the same training as the trustees, but they just didn't get a vote. Although in a sense, I suppose they did, because they got influenced by being able to speak. And in fact, one of them is on this call. And that was really helpful, I think, for them, giving them the confidence to step up to being a trustee, but helpful for us as a board in bringing a different group of people and voices onto the board who we would not otherwise have had, and therefore a level of challenge that we might not otherwise have had.
That's really interesting and yeah, useful, really practical as well. Thank you, Kit. Sonu, so I think same question to you, which is, how do you know that you're doing this well?
I love everything Kit said. It's quite a hard act to follow. I'm going to jump in with some further thoughts. I obviously did outline the pitfalls that I've seen, but obviously, this is a vast topic. So it strikes me there are a couple of other suggestions I can make. Obviously, getting closer to the work if you can, to help you understand how it's working, and perhaps, as Kit says, if you can't get to speak to the people that you're delivering the work to, perhaps you could observe some of the work in progress, or you could speak to the practitioners who are delivering it, and that can be a really valuable insight into what the work is, and also can spark further thoughts about what changes could be needed, or what learning could be gleaned. Another thing that boards can think about is having an audit. So there are board audit tools available on NCBO and a variety of different places, but you can have a regular assessment of what kinds of experience, skills, and people you have in the room, and think therefore about what any gaps that might be arising, or as people obviously have trustee terms that end that you might be about to lose, so that you can recruit appropriately onto the board for the mix that you need. And a final thought is obviously training. Things can change, and trustee boards, just like everyone else, can learn about new developments, new changes coming up. And there are a number of different really great training providers out there. So if you're a charity that works with elderly people, you might want to learn about safeguarding, and you might want to have an organization come in to tell you about changes in the law, and to tell you about how that might affect your service users, and how safeguarding responsibilities need to be addressed, for example. So those are sort of some quick thoughts. And finally, you could also commission, there are governance experts out there, depending on your size and budget, who will do governance reviews of your meetings, of your structures, of your board. But a kind of quick and easy way of doing that is to, as you have new trustees join, just ask them about their reflections, have them join a meeting, have them observe a meeting before they technically join, and have them give you their reflections on how the board operates. And you'll probably learn quite a lot just from their questions, if they have seen other boards or been part of boards before.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Sonal. And we have a couple of questions in the chat. This is probably your last chance to get your questions in before we'll move to the wrap up. So Sharn, I'll come to you. There's the kind of question about, how do you know that you're doing it well? And also a specific question for you following your presentation from Hayley, which is the reports that you produce on risks shared with the board at every meeting. Some charities seem to review the risk register once a year. So pick up either of those as it suits you.
Well, let me touch on the first one very quickly. Very much echo what Kit and Sonal have said. I guess from my perspective, it's always helpful to get an independent person coming in and just sitting in, whether that's a professional or whether that's maybe a beneficiary of the charity. Those are always good dynamics to have, and then almost getting the debrief from an independent perspective. The other is ensuring that everyone is actually voicing their opinions. And one of the things that I've seen there is having sort of live surveys being carried out throughout the trustee board, all on iPads, so that you don't have that loud voice in the room that is influencing everyone else. You're actually getting everyone's raw emotion and raw feedback coming through, and the chair's job is then to navigate and ensure that discussion is sort of is fair to all of the perspectives. And on the question from Hayley, I guess it depends on the organisation, and it depends on the risks, and it depends on how extreme or how well managed they are at the executive level. So within BT, we will be looking at the risk register on a quarterly basis. On some of my pension trustee roles, we'll be looking at it at every meeting. On one of my charity roles, we look at it at every finance committee meeting, but once a year at the board level. So it very much depends on what's needed for the organisation. But if it is a short, succinct sort of dashboard that's only 3 slides, that's a lot easier to have to manage. And if it already frames all of the discussions at the board, then it's always useful to have in my mind anyway.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we'll make this our last question before we move to wrap up. So I'm not sure if everybody would like to come in on this, or people who've got particular experience or got another extra one at the in under the wire. Okay, so I'll read you these both. You can pick up whichever you like. So from Andy, how do you see subcommittees working with the main board, and what are the indicators that that's being done well? And from Alexa, general guidance on conflict resolution within the board or between the trustee board and the team, the executive team. So yeah, some kind of final wrap-up comments. If you can weave in responses to those questions, then that would be ideal. Let's go to Sonal first, if that's okay.
Sure. Really great questions. With subcommittees, I guess the purpose is to allow people to get into further depth with those particular topics. So if it's finance, if it's HR, whatever it is, the purpose is to allow and enable more informed discussion, and for that to then be brought to the main board, either just to kind of then report back and enable ratification of discussions and decisions made, or to sort of support the main board with its decision making. So I think that's the best indication that that's working well, that you can spend a proportionate amount of time on a subject. And so, for example, that finance discussions don't take over the whole board meeting. So I think there's no hard and fast rule to this, but I would imagine that it would, as long as you feel that you're getting through enough of the right subjects at the right times, and the chair can help define the kind of frequency at which things are discussed. So, for example, if a finance committee for a school, for example, might meet once a term, whereas for a charity, it might meet, let's say, quarterly, to review performance and then to kind of look at the quarterly accounts and report back to the main board. In terms of the second question about conflict resolution, I think this is a much more complicated issue. And I think, again, it really comes back to really effective chairing. There are obviously expert agencies that can help with this, like ACAS, and it really depends on the issue. But clearly, for a charity to function well, that conflict resolution needs to be really understood and got into, and the issues themselves aired appropriately, and for people to feel heard respectfully, but then for resolution to come and action to be taken.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Shan, I'll come to you for closing thoughts next.
Just on Andy's question around how subcommittees work well with the main board, it comes back to what Kit was talking about earlier of ensuring that you're documenting the meeting really well. The minutes need to capture the discussion in sufficient detail that someone else looking back at the minutes can understand the essence of the discussion and why a decision was taken. And ultimately, at a board level, you rely on those discussions being taken at the subcommittees. If you end up repeating the discussions at the board, that's usually an indicator that that's not being done well. And if there's if you don't have the right delegation of authority, if you haven't been clear what's delegated down to the subcommittee and what is still retained at the main board, then you might end up with these gaps where the subcommittee is looking at everything and the board is just completely hands off, which again doesn't work. Or there's a gap that so the subcommittee thought that it's something for the board and the board thought it's something for the subcommittee. So that's probably my closing thoughts on that one.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And Kit, to you for your thoughts on these two.
Yeah, so I'd echo what Shan was saying, and I think kind of flipping it around a little bit as well. I think there's something about deciding which committees you need, because it'll vary by charity, so, and maybe the way to work that out might be, if you feel that there's too much time being spent at a board meeting talking about particular topics, maybe it's time to take those out and put them somewhere else into a subcommittee. Or if there are too many people at the board who don't feel that they have the expertise to contribute to that conversation, and so you're kind of wasting their time a little bit by having it at the board level. So that's one thing. So having the right committees and then having the right people on them with the right delegated authorities and clarity about what their terms of reference are. So that's one thing. And then what needs to happen then is they need to report back effectively. So make sure the minutes, good minutes, as Shan was saying, go to the whole board so they can read them and see what was discussed. But what we find quite useful is that we, at the end of each of the committee meetings, subcommittee meetings, and it helps with those meetings as well to round them off, but is to say, right, okay, what are the key points that go in a little box at the top of those minutes that are the sort of, for the rest of the board, if you read nothing else, read this bit, about the key topics discussed, the key decisions made or the key recommendations being made to the board. So there's a really quick sort of summary about, you know, the important stuff to go back up to the board. And then on a different topic, which kind of relates to the conflict resolution, but also is a little bit about the sort of the boundaries and so on. I think it's important for the chair and the chief executive to, or the chair particularly, to consider whether their role in relation to the chief executive is coach or mentor. And actually, it's a bit of a blend of both, depending on the circumstances, but they're subtly different. So the coach is kind of more about asking questions, drawing the person out into self-awareness to sort of, you know, to develop. The mentoring is more bringing your own expertise and saying, well, have you thought about this, that, or the other? So that's just a final thought on the sort of the relationship, if you like, between the board and the team as represented by the relationship between the chair and the chief exec.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, all of you. Really super interesting, really engaging, and lots of common themes here. One from me, I think, which has kind of come out in all of the presentations, and I just wanted to draw together, is the importance of kind of concise and usable information as a much more kind of effective way to navigate the board and being an effective board, rather than the tendency to kind of seek reassurance in completeness of information, understanding that in fact that just makes it really quite inaccessible and people find it much harder to engage with. And the other big theme I think for me today is this kind of, with the mission focus, making space to have that kind of supportive discussion, but a discussion where people feel comfortable to share their differing opinions. And I think a lot of the kind of nuance around good governance really rests in the ability to do that. So a really big thank you to our speakers today. I appreciate you giving your time and so generously and your thoughts. Thank you. A thank you again to the Clothworkers for supporting this event and making the event series possible. A request to you that you do fill out a feedback form for us. We do take your feedback really seriously, and it helps us to make these events better in the future. So really appreciate if you could take the 5 minutes to fill out that form, which is in the chat, and I think will probably come to you in an email afterwards. That follow-up email will include the relevant links and to the things we've been talking about today, and the slides. We'll double check that our speakers are happy to share the slides, but where we can, we'll share those slides with you. And there'll be a recording which is available on our YouTube channel shortly. A quick reminder that if you're thinking about the next election and what you might be doing in your charity with regards to campaigning or trying to kind of influence the conversation around the election, you'll find it useful to come to our event on the 20th of March from 1 to 2, where we'll be talking about exactly that, that kind of dynamic and what it means for trustees, how to navigate it successfully. And I think that's it from me, and we've come in right on time. So a final thank you so much for joining us. Really enjoyed being with you all today, and wish you a successful afternoon to come. Thanks. Bye-bye.